beats and arcs in serialized television. Yet the incorporation of transmedia elements within an overall story world requires essential reassessment of how seriality has changed in contemporary digital culture, especially when professional and fan-produced transmedia each contribute to the overall narrative whole. However, in some ways, placing emphasis on non-corporate elements of modern transmedia networks is less a commentary on new forms of storytelling than a return to pre-copyright practices like the collaborative construction of fairy tales. Thus, shifting focus from corporate-only transmedia as the standard and thinking instead about fan works as transmedia equalizes all narrative investments and promotes the freedom of any audience member to offer their own interpretations and desires into the official text. Fan works, including fan fiction, fan art, and fan video collage or vids, and earlier transmedia traditions like fairy tales, thus elucidate and complicate the picture of seriality within professional transmedia franchises, while also introducing their own unique processes for constructing a serial narrative backchannel. I just want to make a quick note before I move into the center of my argument, which is that this is part of a much longer paper, and this paper is part of a much longer project. So hopefully I'm giving you an interesting teaser, not just simply something a bit frustrating. But please ask further questions in the question and answer period, because I have lots more to say. Before dealing with the serial character of fan works, the ontological status of various transmedia components must be addressed to resolve how fan production of fan fiction, art, and video relates to the larger narrative whole. Taking fan works seriously requires challenging the authority of both authors and copyright holders to determine a story's meaning and legitimacy. The boundaries and components of corporate transmedia narratives most often result from a combination between money and power, making fan works a grassroots alternative that places emphasis on the audience's preferences, contributions, and control. Many recent changes in corporate transmedia narration can be attributed to the shifting social and legal meaning of authorship and the industry's evolving business models, rather than any inherent artistic properties of new media. In this, remembering the collaborative processes through which artists, storytellers, and private individuals all co-produced fairy tale culture over the course of hundreds of years is instructive because it serves as a reminder that not all aspects of contemporary digital culture are purely the result of technological innovation, but rather have long antecedents. Yet the industry's turn towards telling stories that take place across a variety of mediated formats is often framed as a new development caused by the possibilities within Web 2.0. As noted by Mary Laurie Ryan, story worlds which multiple authors and artists interpreted in many media trace their history far further back than the social web, to at least classical Greece and perhaps even before. Even if the definition of transmedia is restricted to stories that incorporate so-called old and new media, fans as well as independent authors and artists have been exploring the possibilities of online multimedia storytelling since the very beginning of the internet. Indeed, fairy tale themes were common in many of the first collaboratively authored story worlds, such as fantasy-oriented role-playing games that incorporated text, art, video, and live-action transmedia elements. Nevertheless, often discussions of transmedia only incorporate consideration of corporate forms of transmedia narration, ignoring independent, collaborative, and fan-produced material. In comparison to such non-commercial material, hallmarks of early corporate transmedia like The Matrix and Lost arrived to the internet fairly late. Rather than unique moments in the history of narrative, these series pinpoint important landmarks in media history because they mark changes in corporate strategy. Ryan recounts a conversation between scholar Henry Jenkins and an unnamed filmmaker that encapsulates this change. The filmmaker explains that the mainstream media's historic preference for strong stories shifted over time towards strong characters, around whom a series of stories might be told, but then shifted again to a preference for fictional worlds within which numerous characters and stories might develop. However, many fans of genres of literature, alternate media, and folk practices have long treated stories as narrative worlds that could be rewritten and expanded in multiple directions. For the industry, this transformation revolves around changing strategies for ownership, requiring cross-platform conglomeration. Furthermore, a flexible approach to authorship was required to dissociate these multiple story products from a single author, so that each medium could tell the stories most suited to its own format, without diluting the authority of those stories told in other media. These alterations in corporate strategy influence the meaning and legitimacy assigned to various components of transmedia narratives. Some franchises cling to the central function of the author to provide overall coherency and limits to their story world, Thus, for example, the boundaries of Harry Potter are determined by J.K. Rowling's somewhat dubious intentions, about which much more is to be said. Yet increasingly, studios more and more transparently treat transmedia narratives as a piece of their own corporate intellectual property, over which no author holds an ultimate authoritative vision, as in the recent decision by Alloy Entertainment to fire the original author of The Vampire Diaries and continue publishing books under her name, which were actually written by a ghostwriter. Thus, it becomes increasingly obvious that the limits of transmedia narrative worlds are imposed by legal questions of ownership and licensing, not the inherent creative integrity of the story itself. Therefore, insisting upon treating unlicensed fan works as legitimate parts of the overall story structure takes on an even more clearly populist political resonance, tying fan media production to earlier forms of folk and community media production. Who really determines characters' personalities, the rules of a fictional universe, and ultimately what really happened? While some answers to these questions might be more interesting, convincing, moving, or pleasurable to imagine than others, there is no a priori reason to assume that these will always be produced by authors recognized as original in the publication process, or by authors contractually licensed to corporations. The death of the author settles the moral question of who has the right to tell stories. Once it is accepted that everyone has equal authority to participate in the co-creation of culture, and no necessary reason remains to grant greater value to the first version of the story over many retellings, transformations, and adaptations, the only remaining hurdle to the proliferation of participatory story worlds is the artificial legal boundary imposed by intellectual property law. Similarly, statements like Ryan's consigning fan work to the level of apocrypha, or Carlos Scolari, whose taxonomy would classify fan works as peripheral, undermine the full potential of fan works to unseat the industry's monopoly on public culture. If fan works are considered fully legitimate and ontologically valid contributions to the overall transmedia narrative, then not only does the practice of transmedia gain a much longer and more democratic history than provided by corporate transmedia projects, but fan works also significantly complicate the question of how transmedia serial narration can function. Including fan works such as fan fiction, fan art, and fan video collage within transmedia story worlds may at first appear to render sequential storytelling and seriality nearly impossible. By their very nature, transmedia narratives may unfold in different sequences across a different time frame for each audience member. Yet fan narratives not only publish narratives out of sequence, but also contain numerous alternate interpretations and versions of the same events. In this, they again do not so much mark an innovation of digital storytelling made possible only through the web, but harken back to community-authored story worlds like fairy tales, in which numerous individual storytellers, musicians, and artists creatively reinterpreted and added to the story world over time, expanding and replacing narrative elements in serial cycles, yet without a fixed sequential seriality. However, these complications need not negate the role of seriality. Rather, they call for a reevaluation and expansion of the serial form and function. First, remembering the collaborative folk production of fairy tales and the contemporary production of fan works emphasizes the increasingly complex nature of seriality in all transmedia, and the way in which serial effects do not vanish, but more and more depend on viewer or audience's choices. Secondly, fan works and fairy tales also create their own kind of flexible and multiple serial effects, wherein meaning does not depend on consuming a specific sequence of narratives, but instead upon reading any collection of narratives within larger cycles or tropes, to assemble a sense of flowing norms, genres, and preferences. First, fan works further complicate the increasingly complex nature of seriality in transmedia, emphasizing the mainstreaming of audience agency over the speed and order of narrative events, while adding the option for the audience to intervene and usurp corporate narration entirely. As noted by Ruth Page, scholars have most often identified seriality as a result of the separation of stories into a fixed sequence of installments and the publishing schedule, which requires that audiences wait between installments. The experience of shared waiting has historically performed an important function in terms of narrative and social structure. As a narrative form, the imposition of fixed blocks of time between installments allows for the traditional beats and arc structure of television, and encourages writers to increase tension at predefined climactic moments that precede periods of shared waiting, before each commercial break, at the end of an episode, and at mid-season and season finales. As a social form, shared waiting also intensifies the audience's sense of themselves as an imagined community, because all experience this period of anticipation together. Yet both physical and social technologies have long allowed some segments of the audience to undermine publishers' installment schedule and follow the story at their own pace. Serialized novels were often also eventually published as a compendium, while the arrival of the home VHS machine granted audiences an unprecedented level of control over television scheduling. The binge viewing and time shifting common in recent years are often attributed to the sale of television on DVD as well as DVR, streaming technology, and file sharing technology. Yet in actuality, these merely extend the behaviors of fan communities to mainstream viewers. Because fans distributed taped collections of episodes through the mail and at conventions, they no longer remained at the mercy of the industry's scheduling systems, and thereby claimed the autonomy to rewatch and binge view television long before the internet. However, now that such practices have spread beyond cult audiences, serialized television can no longer take for granted that the bulk of the audience will view installments at the same pace. The fixed sequence of installments may seem like an even more critical characteristic of seriality. It may appear wholly unintuitive and unpleasurable to imagine, for example, reading the chapters of a novel out of sequence. Yet increasingly, transmedia franchises offer flexible narratives, wherein pieces remain interdependent while encouraging the audience to choose their own sequence. In some ways, this model is a throwback to earlier forms of episodic television, wherein each episode offered new permutations of the show's themes, but always returned characters to the same baseline, so that they could begin the next episode from the same starting point. Such formats allowed viewers to pleasurably watch only a few episodes out of the season, and critically facilitated syndication so that episodes could be rescreened multiple times in any order without significantly disrupting audience interest. Yet these older episodic structures also inhibited significant growth and change, attributes increasingly vital to the development of so-called quality television and most transmedia franchises. How then can a story world simultaneously support both a flexible user-controlled sequence and radical change in characters, plot, and setting? Three concepts help explain the way in which both professionally and fan-produced transmedia narratives can maintain both the highly prized markers of complex narration, as well as user-controlled flexible seriality. First, an understanding of narration as movement from information-poor encounters to information-rich encounters, rather than movement through a fixed plot. Second, the notion of a quantum narrative multiverse, rather than a unitary narrative world. And third, consequently, foregrounding seriality as an effect experienced by the audience rather than a predetermined or uniform intention of the producers. In her self-published essay, The Advantages of Fan Fiction as an Art Form, a Shameless Essay, Jane Mortimer describes seriality as a relationship between the baseline and, quote, the momentary focus of intensity on 2 square inches. In other words, she argues that very small statements, gestures, and moments in serials can carry incredible intensity and payoff for audiences because of their relationship to a pre-existing baseline of repeated and expected character psychology, behavior, or plot development. One of the chief pleasures of fan fiction, she argues, is that authors may use the audience's pre-existing knowledge of the baseline to cut directly to the payoff moment of experimentation that becomes resonant in relation to audience expectations and previous story segments. The same could be said of many retellings and reinterpretations of fairy tales, which often draw their impact from surprising deviations from other versions, or the delay in satisfying audience desire for specific favorite events or characters. While this theory does not explain the pleasures of many transformative works, while this theory does in fact explain the pleasures of many transformative works, it cannot fully account for the relatively common practice of reading or viewing fan works without having previously encountered the professionally published source, nor transmedia narratives' increasing tendency to start from moments of complex conflict and then require the audience to work backwards and build the baseline in reverse. Different pleasures are at play when an audience enters a narrative already in progress and then must retrospectively move from a position of reading the text as an information-poor to an information-rich interpreter. The narrative question transforms from what will happen to who are these people and why have these things happened? While seriality no longer offers a linear sequence of events, but instead an alinear, flexible sequence of information, each piece of which enriches the viewer, listener, or reader's ability to reinterpret the central events. Lost and Once Upon a Time offer paradigmatic examples of this technique, as both allow the audience to slowly piece together the characters' histories and personalities from a transmedia series of narratives presented out of order and on multiple platforms. In fan communities, a game called Stranger in a Strange Fandom exemplified the tendency of many audiences of fan works to engage with fan interpretations in independent from the professional text. Participants were asked to watch a vid, which is a form of fan remix video, for which they had never previously seen the professional source. Participants then wrote a description of the source material based on what they could piece together from the vid, resulting in an enormous range from hilarious to shockingly accurate inferences. Lost, Once Upon a Time, and Stranger in a Strange Fandom all play upon the shifting process of interpretation, as audiences slowly gather more information about the narrative world by interacting with more of its components. Importantly, the guesses and inferences made by audiences at the very beginning of this process need not be considered wrong or worse than those made later in the game by audience members acting with more information. This is a chief point of difference from possible worlds theory, which postulates that readers and viewers constantly compare the ontological validity of story segments to the real world and other parts of the story world. As the enjoyment of those playing Stranger in a Strange Fandom game implies, moving towards an information-rich interpretive position does not involve discerning the truth. There are merely different pleasures available at different stages and with different informational frames. Yet still in all of these examples, seriality and narrative do continue to function, particularly as producers move towards a model of transmedia in which audiences are expected to enter a story world from any medium. The primacy of one medium over the others has been displaced by an expectation that audiences will move between different media independently and unexpectedly, constructing their own serial sequence without reference to publication dates. Audiences only access pieces of the narrative world one at a time, and slowly accumulate a greater and greater understanding of the order of events in the characters' lives at their own pace and in their own order. They still encounter the story in serial installments, but the order and speed of their travels, and thus the narrative and serial structures, become self-determined. In addition, the ability to simultaneously provide flexible forms of transmedia seriality and maintain coherent narratives is facilitated by a transition from regarding the story as one shared narrative world held in common by the entire audience and production team to the notion of quantum narrative multiverse. Ryan considers story segments which modify or contradict character actions, key events, or core characteristics of other segments difficult, if not impossible, for professional transmedia, and maintains that such internal contradiction must remain the domain of apocryphal fan texts. Yet this assertion overlooks many genre forms, including the fairy tale, which incorporate multiple timelines and the narrative possibilities of treating fan works as legitimate parts of the overall transmedia story network, wherein they may either exist in parallel or actually change and assert the audience's understanding of the professional text. For example, comic books have long mastered the ability to spin off multiple timelines so that each character may live many different lives. And this tendency only magnified when comics expanded into transmedia via film, television, and online components. Many of these function largely by keeping most aspects of the baseline intact and altering different components for each timeline, creating a series of what-if proposals. Although fans, of course, endlessly debate their preferences, the characters of one timeline are no less real than those of any other. Yet those who have read how a single character develops and reacts in other timelines approach new storylines in a more information-rich position, because that timeline will resonate and interact with their previous knowledge, allowing them to assemble a much more layered narrative web than a fan meeting a character for the first time. Thus, it does not take very much effort to understand that in almost any Marvel timeline, Wolverine is a tough Canadian with the mutant ability to regenerate, and thus to construct a baseline. Yet, as opposed to new viewers, fans seeing him for the second, third, fourth, or fifth time will receive different pleasure from the first instance in a given timeline that he lights a cigar, or in some iterations, his sudden, surprising refusal to don Noah's spandex. The longtime fan thus creates a unique serial experience gained through reading across multiple timelines, learning more about the many paths individual characters and plots may take, depending on alterations in characteristics of the overall timeline. Thus, the multiverse concept allows for the investigation of an infinite variety of narrative adaptations across multiple forms of media. No one story or story sequence need maintain ultimate authority as real or true in a multiverse-style narrative, as none actually negate the others and all remain equally possible. Audiences thereby construct seriality through multiverse transmedia narration in two directions, by creating a sequence of story elements through one timeline, which flow across multiple media, and also by creating a sequential path across timelines. Further, in multiverse narration, it doesn't matter if audiences begin with a timeline created by a sanctioned or unsanctioned professional or transformative author. Wherever each audience member begins becomes their starting point, and because all timelines are valid, the audience is not missing any information. but rather gaining greater complexity no matter which narrative path they choose. Thinking of serial narration as increasing information acquisition within a multiverse also foregrounds a turn towards considering seriality as an effect experienced by the audience rather than a predetermined intention of the producers or the publication schedule. Page argues that scholars must consider the innovative forms of seriality constructed by new media platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Wikipedia. In a parallel move, transmedia stories form a bridge between older forms of seriality, earlier pre-copyright forms of expression such as fairy tale folk practices, and the new structures described by Page, because while some components of a transmedia story may comply entirely with conventional series television, transmedia multiverses allow individual audience members to assemble their own cross-media narrative sequences, including components with new forms of seriality and both professionally and fan-created elements. Although unplanned and uncontrolled, the sequence of narrative encounters that each individual audience member collects is experienced by that person as a coherent series, which gradually provides them more information, access, and insight into the entire narrative multiverse. One might similarly call the narrative itself an effect rather than an intentional design, by emphasizing the coherence and structure that the audience provides while interacting with a dispersed network of potential narrative elements, and choosing how to navigate, add to, nullify, or connect them. In this manner, even contradictory versions of the same events can still function as a series from the perspective of the viewer or reader, because each deviation further investigates the possibilities within a given premise. Thus, very much like retelling and re-encountering fairy tales in oral storytelling, painting, sculpture, and theater, the addition of fan works to a contemporary transmedia multiverse provides a serial effect that deepens understanding of the story in multiple segments over time. Unpacking the transmedia serial structures within fan works thus reveals the complex narratives constructed by fan communities ever since their old media story worlds crossed from slide projector to song to VHS to print to spoken word and back again, while also demonstrating the vast richness of experiences, aesthetics, and affect at play in fan